Please let's welcome Peter Bühlmann.
Thank you very much. I feel very honored to give this lecture here, and also I would like to express my thanks. I really enjoy being here at the conference. I would like to thank the organizers for having set up such a wonderful conference. But this is about causal inference, and well, maybe I should first acknowledge my main collaborators for the research I'm presenting today. This is Jonas Peters from the NPI in Tübingen and Nikolai Meinshausen from our seminar for statistics at ETH Zurich. So, this is about causal inference, and well, it's a nice name. Causal, I think, is a very ambitious word, right? In general, we think of something extremely ambitious, something extremely interesting, and of course that's what it is. But sometimes I find it a bit more accessible if you think about intervention analysis. And I would like to make the point a bit more clear what the kind of questions are I'm interested in. I have exposure to genomics, to computational biology, and in genomics, say, particularly simple organisms like yeast or plants, a question would be, if we would make an intervention, an outside manipulation at a single or at many genes, what would be their effect on a response variable of interest? And biologists call it a phenotype of interest. And you'll see in my next slide, this could be like the growth rate of a plant. And I want to predict or infer these effects without actually doing the intervention. And that means from so-called observational data. If you don't quite know what it is, you could think of this, these are observations from the steady-state system of the plant or of the organism. And actually I go a bit further in this talk. This is a bit non-standard type causal inference. I'm also interested in, well, how can I predict these effects from, say, observational and interventional data with maybe well-specified interventions where I know what kind of interventions I did, or even more generally, can I predict this effect under changing environments or different experimental settings where actually the interventions are not very clearly specified. So here's the first concrete example. This is flowering of Arabidopsis thaliana. This is the model plant. That's how it looks like. This is very easy to plant. It grows quite quickly, so you can do cheap experiments. The phenotype, or the response variable of interest, I denote it always by Y. This is the statistical notation. It's my response variable. It's the days it takes until the plant is bolting, or the days it takes until the plant is flowering. And the underlying goal is to produce fast-flowering plants, fast-flowering crops eventually, so that's kind of the question of interest. We measure very many, let's call it covariates, other variables. I denote them always by X. And these are the gene expressions from essentially the whole genome of Arabidopsis thaliana, but there are a bit more than 20,000 variables which we measure. And the question is exactly the one from before: can we infer or predict the effect of knocking out, manipulating a single gene on the phenotype, this response variable of interest, and the response variable is the days it takes until the plant is flowering. Okay, so actually what we did a while ago, we used some sort of statistical or machine learning method based on 47 observational data points only. So this is a very high-dimensional scenario, lots of variables which we measure, more than 20,000, plot a response, and I have 47 data points, observational data points. This is just from wild-type plant, so this is a plant where there were no gene manipulations. And then, you know, you get some sort of a hit list, and you try to validate the top predictions. You can actually go ahead and do some randomized experiments in the lab. This is what we did, and we had some sort of moderate success, so some of these gene manipulations indeed gave rise to a plant which was flowering more quickly than the wild-type plant. So that's the sort of setting I'm looking at. But here's the next example. This is gene expressions in yeast. So this is baker's yeast. So maybe you have breakfast in the morning, you're eating good bread. I think there's an advertisement of the baker here, the local bakery. He's making the best bread in Amsterdam. I'm sure he uses something like that, baker's yeast. So there are more than 5,000 genes in the genome of baker's yeast. And here I have a multivariate setting of the question I looked at before. So the phenotype, or the response variable of interest, Y, is the expression of my first gene. and the covariates X are the expressions of all other genes. So all other 5,359 genes are the explanatory variables. And then I go to the phenotype, the response of another one. So Y is now the expression of the second gene. It's kind of like a different problem. And the covariates are the expressions of all other remaining genes, and so on and so forth. And the question is exactly the same as before. Can we infer, predict the effects of a single gene deletion on all other genes? And all other genes means the expression on all other genes. If I manipulate one gene, what could be the effect on the expression of some of the other genes? Okay. And so actually we did that a while ago, effects of single gene deletions on all other genes. This is joint work with Marloes Maathaus, who's here as well. So again, I remind you about the problem. So we have a bit more than 5,000 genes involved. One of them is always the response. The others are the covariates. And we also have 231 gene deletion experiments. So actually people have deleted genes. And because they did knock out these genes, you could actually see what happens, right? So this is kind of like the test data. You put it aside. You try to predict the effects of these gene deletions on potentially all other genes. So if I knock out a gene, it has 5,359 possibilities to have an effect on another one. Times 231, this gives a bit more than 1 million potential effects. So let's say the truth is known in good approximation. Thanks to these intervention experiments, we actually know what has happened. And the goal was a while ago, and published in 2010, can we predict these intervention effects from just observational data? And what we had at that time was 63 observational data points. So these are 63 yeast organisms which were not manipulated, just wild-type yeast, and you tried to predict them. And so here you see an ROC-type curve. So on the x-axis you see the false positives, on the y-axis you see the true positives. It may be hard to see from the back here, but you have this projection to the side. So there's the fine dotted line in blue. This is random guessing. And then there are two curves here. These are regression techniques, modern regression techniques for high-dimensional settings like the lasso, elastic net. And they do maybe slightly better than random guessing, but not really. And then there is another technique here, which is based on the PC algorithm and the IDA algorithm to derive bounds of causal effects, and then you can actually sort or do a ranking, and then you get this performance. Okay, so it sounds good, and I would also think it was really a good finding for a very difficult problem. So the problem is very high dimensional, it's very noisy, it's very difficult, but, well, after the years you think more critically about your own work, and I think it was nice work, it is really good work, but some criticisms apply, I would say. Actually, the result is maybe not so robust. So it depends somewhat how we define the truth. If you knock out the gene, if you intervene at the gene, then of course you would intuitively say, okay, if there was a large effect on another one, if it's really large, it's a true one. But how do you define this? I'm not going into details about this, but unfortunately the results depend quite a bit how you define the truth. So this has been communicated by Joris and others to us just orally. Then the other thing is it's kind of old, publicly available data. So the old data means it's really not the modern technology. Publicly available is good, but the bad thing was in a way, well, it was just downloaded from the web, so it was no real collaborator involved. So I think this is not ideal. It's okay, publicly available is great, but ideally you have a collaborator. And maybe the last point, which is a bit more methodological, we didn't use the interventional data also for trying to estimate the result, right? So we have 231 interventional data points, so maybe we want to make use of them. So now we have a new and maybe better, or hopefully better, or we think it's maybe a bit better attempt for the same kind of problem. So the problem is single gene knockdown in yeast, and we measure genome-wide expression exactly as before. The new thing is we have collaborators actually from the Netherlands. These are great people. They are having very good technology. They have publicly available data, but we also communicate with them. So I think that's a bit a better condition to do something really good. I'm not sure whether we achieved the good thing, but it's a good starting point that we have these collaborators. Okay, so what do we do? So we need to formalize this problem, right? I had this slide, regression will not do the job. Of course, the experts here know regression is fundamentally the wrong thing. So we have to address this if I would do question with a causal inference. And we look at graphical models and structural equation models. And if you haven't seen that, I just go very briefly into that. So we have variables, they're random variables, and the random variable is represented as a node in the graph. And we think that there is a true underlying causal influence diagram, and just by plausible arguments, or if you just look at the picture, you would easily understand what it means. So for example, variable number 11 is caused by 5, and variable number 2 is caused by 11, and so on and so forth. So the direction of the arrows tell me about the cause. So obviously this is a powerful language of graphs. It makes formulations and models more transparent. This has been pointed out by Evans and Richardson not too long ago, and many people here know this kind of language. So here is the setting. I have my variables. Say in my gene expression flowering example, I have a response variable y, and I denote it always as the last variable in my collection of variables. I have p plus one variable. The last one is my response, and x1, x2, up to xp are my covariates. Okay. Then I assume I have this, there exists this true underlying causal influence diagram in terms of a directed acyclic graph. It's exactly this object here. And then additional to the structure, you put some sort of the quantitative structure on the structure with a structural equation model. And that says the jth variable is a function, a true function, and to emphasize the truth, I put a little 0 here. So this is the true underlying function, and these are the parental variables, and there is an error term. And the error terms are assumed to be independent. So, for example, well known is a linear structural, maybe Gaussian equation model. So xj is a linear combination of the parental variables with a regression parameter, a true underlying regression parameter, beta 0 plus error term, and the error might be Gaussian. Okay? So here, what are the parental variables? I hope it's kind of clear. So, for example, variable number 11 is a direct function of the parents. The parents is just here the 5 and the 7 here as well. So it's a function of 5 and 7 and error term. Okay, that's what it is. So I'm interested actually mainly in the causal variables for my y variable. So in my plant example, I'm not really interested about the causal variables for some of these other gene expressions. I want to find the causal variables for my y. And so I denote that in the talk by S0. So these are the variables which are parents of y. This is diagram. So for 11, it's 5 and 7 are the causal variables. Sometimes I'm also interested in the causal coefficients. For example, if it's a linear structural equation model, I would also like to know this true underlying linear coefficient in the structural equation. So many people here know this, but I think it's worth pointing out. There are severe issues of identifiability. If somebody doesn't give you the structure, and if you would like to estimate the structure just from data, observational data, maybe also a mix of observational and interventional data, there are severe identifiability issues. And the simplest example is a bivariate Gaussian. Suppose you have two random variables, x and y. They're bivariate Gaussian, they're correlated, but nobody can tell you from observational data from back distribution whether x causes y or y causes x. There's an identifiability problem. Both kind of DAGs give rise to the same probability distribution. Nevertheless, my problem I'd like to look at and address is how can we construct confidence statements whether x causes y or y causes x. Of course, here it's impossible, but in general, maybe we can achieve something. And I want to do that without knowing the structure. So I really do something, I just have data, I don't know the underlying causal influence diagram, and I'd like to derive confidence statements. And this is a very hard problem because exactly of these severe identifiability issues. And I'd like to make a bit the point that at least how I see it at the moment, the route via graphical model seems extremely difficult and awkward to come up with confidence statements in absence of having knowledge of the true underlying inference pattern. Let me try to explain this a bit more. So what is the typical agenda for estimation? Somebody just gives you data and you want to infer causal effects. So the typical agenda would be, okay, first you estimate the DAG. Now if there's an identifiability problem, you can only estimate an equivalence class of the true underlying DAG. You can only estimate the Markov equivalence class of the true underlying DAG. So this is a collection of DAGs and you denote it by script D0. So there are nice algorithms like Chickering's algorithm, the GES, which gives me an estimate of the Markov equivalence class. And I denote that estimate by script D hat. Okay, because of these identifiability issues, I can only get a handle on the equivalence class. And once you have this equivalence class, you try to derive the causal variables, namely the ones which are causal in all the members of the equivalence class. Right? You look at your equivalence class, conceptually, you enumerate all the DAGs, and if there is a variable which is always causal in all the DAGs, that must be a real causal variable. And in general, this is not possible, or it's rare that this happens, but you might be able to come up with bounds of causal effects. Okay? So that's a typical agenda. Now, if you want to construct confidence statements, this becomes very awkward and very hard, because in the first step you estimate the structure, the graph, or the equivalence class. So this is some sort of a structure estimation problem. And then afterwards, you would need to make statements, say, on the strengths of this, say, linear edge weights in a linear structural equation model. And of course, if you would ignore the issue that you have estimated the graph, you could do this. But how can you incorporate actually the uncertainty of estimating the graph, estimating the equivalence class? And that really brings me into the setting of post-selection inferences, quite a well-studied area in statistics. And these people, Pötscher, Leb, and Pötscher, they pointed out many very difficulties if you actually do that. You estimate the structure first and you try to do inference afterwards. It's very hard, very difficult, very awkward, and they have actually a lot of negative results that it is impossible. So, I'm not saying that it is impossible in general, but maybe this route of trying to estimate the structure first is a very difficult one. Now you can try to say, okay, let's do something direct. Let's try to do a direct likelihood-based inference, and that's in a way very difficult because of these severe identifiability issues. So it seems to be a very awkward, difficult problem, but I want to do something. And our goal is, and what we will actually do, and what I try to explain a bit, I construct a method, an algorithm, a procedure. I denote it by S hat. It takes a subset of my possible variables, 1 to p, so this is x1, x2, xp. These are the possible potential causal variables for y. And I want to make S hat such that with high probability, I can adjust for that. I can choose my alpha, like 95%. That the probability that S hat is contained in the set of true causal variables is controlled as 1 minus alpha. So S hat is a method, and so whenever I have a variable in S hat, I know it must be a true causal variable with probability at least 1 minus. For more the experts, this is not an equal here. This is just a container, it's a subset here. So the beauty of that, I think, I don't need, as a user, I don't need to specify what is identifiable and what is not identifiable. This seems to be a bit like a miracle. This is extremely convenient. I just press the button, I get an S hat, and I don't need to care whether it's identifiable or not. That is, for example, if a variable xj cannot be identified, if it's not possible to identify xj as a causal variable, it will not end up in my second hat. So we do this thing, this construction with, I would say, an entirely new is always a dangerous word, but a fairly new framework, which might be, I'm not sure, but I think it has potential to be quite a bit simpler for causal inference. Maybe it's a bit conservative, but it's some kind of a simple method. And we really avoid graphical model fitting, we avoid potential outcome models. I'm not saying these are bad things, we just take a different perspective on the problem. And maybe this approach, which I'll explain a bit, is more accessible to experts in regression modeling. Okay, so how do we do this? So we call it causal inference using invariant prediction. There's some sort of an invariance principle, and the main message of my talk in a way will be the causal structure, the causal components, they remain the same, they remain invariant for different subpopulations. Okay? And the non-causal part, it can change across subpopulations. And the point is I will have access to subpopulations, as you will see in a moment. So if you have different subpopulations, and if this is true, then the idea is, well, you just look for some sort of stability, some sort of invariance across your subpopulations, and then you know, by the kind of argument I show here, that these must be the causal intervals. Okay, so here is the goal again, formulated in a slightly different context. My goal is to predict, or to find the causal variables or components among a p-dimensional covariate x for a specific response variable y. I remind you, y could be my growth rate in the plant, x is this 20,000 dimensional covariate, and I'd like to know which of the 20,000 genes are causal for y. Now, what is the data which we have access to? The data is, you know, by xe, these are my covariates, ye, and they have a distribution fe. And what is this little e? This little e is an experimental setting. And I have different experimental settings, and I have a space of experimental settings. I denote it by script e. So the point is here, I have really heterogeneous data. I have more than just observational data. I have different experimental settings, e equals 1, e equals 2, e equals 3, and so on. So I have more information than just observational data. So it's different environments, different experiments, and some people would maybe call it, it's an aspect of big data. And in a large database, indeed, you have different experimental conditions, and you might want to explore that. So here it is again. I have my data xe, the covariance response ye. It might have different distribution, fe, for every experimental setting in this space. And in the first example, let's look at where this script E has just two labels, 1 and 2. Label 1 would be my observational data, and label 2 could be potentially unspecific interventional data. Just, you know, there were some interventions, they were rather unspecific, and that's my label 2, that's my experimental setting number 2. Or it could be just two labels encoding observational data for label 1, and maybe very specific intervention with label 2, and maybe repeated measurements on this specific intervention, and maybe I do repeated measurements on that specific intervention with 10 replicas or something like that. And then of course you can have more. The script E could be larger, could have 3 elements or 26. And the point is, I do not need the data at this moment from carefully designed randomized experiments, and that's a dangerous sentence. But I'll try to explain a bit up to what extent you can actually work under this setting. Okay, so here is the main assumption which we've been constructively used for constructing confidence statements and so on. And it's an invariance assumption, and for simplicity, yeah.
These experimental designs. So
No.
what is an example?
Okay, the example could be that in my plant example, so it's observational data is 1, and then a single gene deletion at gene 7 is my E equals 2.
So it's another design.
Yeah. But it might not be very carefully designed, and I'll come a bit to that point. But, yeah. Okay, so here's the main assumption, and I formulate this in a linear model setting, but you can actually generalize this to other settings. And so it reads as follows. I have some sort of a linear model. I have a response y, I have my covariates x, and now I assume, this is my assumption, that for all experimental settings, for all these different subpopulations, I have the same regression parameter gamma star. So the assumption is there exists a regression parameter gamma star, which is the same for all experimental settings. Now, the usual thing is actually the regression coefficient has to be independent of the predictor variables, otherwise you have some sort of a confounding. And so now, what are the predictor variables? You look at the support of gamma star, so these are the variables which have coefficient non-zero of gamma star. I denote it by S star. And so this error term here needs to be independent of the predictors. Okay? So I have errors, and I didn't, well, maybe I didn't formulate this carefully enough, or maybe I repeat myself. So I have the same regression parameter gamma star for all experimental settings. I have an error term epsilon e, and that has the same distribution for all experimental settings, and it has the property that the error distribution, that the error is independent of the non-zero variables which play a role in my regression. Okay. Now, the x itself can have an arbitrary distribution under different experimental settings, so that can shift. So there's kind of a short meaning of that, and the short meaning is, well, the conditional distribution of y given the variables in this set S star is invariant across the experimental setting. This is what this assumption says. Okay. So you have invariance of the conditional for a certain set of variables S star. Okay. So what does this have to do with this causality? And so here's a proposition which is actually very easy to prove, but it's very important to link this invariance to the causal framework. So this invariance assumption is an assumption on my space of experimental settings script E, right? I require something for all experiment in this script E, so it is an assumption for script E. And so now I make a proposition and I assume something on that script E. And the assumption is if this script E does not affect the structural equation for y in a structural equation model. So I assume now a structural equation model. I have one particular structural equation for y, and I assume this script E does not affect that single equation. It might affect all other structural equations, but not that single one. So for example, in a linear structural equation model, under all experiments, ye can be written as a sum of the same parental variables, the same h weights, and the same error term. This is a bit like a tautology, right? So it's the same as this one. So what it says is that, okay, if you take S0 to be the parental variables in your structural equation model, these are the causal variables, so S0, the causal variables, are the parental variables, they are indeed invariant. So S0 satisfies this invariance assumption, so if you choose S star equals S0, this is fulfilled, and then gamma star is actually this regression parameter vector. Now, you can ask, and that's important, you can ask, well, when does this work, right? That's the assumption. So here is the assumption again, this is the conclusion. What about this blue stuff? And now we need to discuss a bit, when does that assumption hold? And that assumption holds, for example, if I do interventions on variables different in y. So if you manipulate something on your other structural equation, and if you assume that manipulation does not have an effect on your y structural equation, you're done. It's trivial, right? But it's kind of important. And you can control for that. If you do a gene manipulation, I actually manipulate on a gene and not on my response, so I really can assume if I do a do intervention, I do not affect my y structural equation. And you can generalize this to other type of interventions. You can look at noise or soft interventions at variables different in y, and then this holds. So if you do interventions at variables different in y, then the causal variables actually satisfy this invariance assumption. Now you can ask, okay, there might be many such sets S star which satisfy the invariance assumption, and that's true. Of course, that's the identifiability issue. I mean, there's not only one, there might be many. And you can ask, well, which one is the best one, the smallest one? And I try to convince you, at least from the perspective and the approach which we propose, this is not really important. So of course, identifiability is an important thing, but I'll do something where this is just not really plain known.
Isn't the minimal always the empty set?
Excuse me?
Isn't the minimal set always the just empty set?
No, not always, but it's a kind of a good question. If I take the empty set, I would require that YE, the distribution of YE, is invariant across all experimental settings. Now you can easily check that. You plot your histograms of YE for the different sets. And if they change, it's not the empty set. If they're the same, it's the empty set, and then you cannot make a causal statement. Okay, so here is maybe towards your question, the invariance assumption I tried to convince you. This is something which is plausible to hold with real data. So this is actually data from gene perturbation experiment, and I just show you two-dimensional views of that data. One gene expression is my x variable, the other one is my y variable, and I do an intervention at a different variable in x and y. And what you see in these plots are, in blue is the observational data, and in orange is the interventional data. So if you do interventions at other genes, how does the expression of that gene look like? And so in the first two panels, the invariance of the conditional distribution seems not to be true, seems to be violated. Why? So if you look at this, so here is the observational data, the interventional data has a larger standard deviation. So here is another example, the observational data and the interventional data, they don't have the same slope. Now here is something which seems invariant, and this is real data, so this really happens. So the observational data is in blue, the interventional data is in orange. Obviously the observational data has smaller standard deviation as marginally in x, but that doesn't play a role. The conditional of y given x seems invariant. They seem to have about the same slope and the same kind of error around the slope. So it seems like this is actually invariant under two experimental settings, and here as well. And actually, if you run a statistical test, whether the conditional distribution is the same among the blue and the orange, you cannot reject that hypothesis. So it seems like plausible that they are the same. So this is something, invariant is really something you can see in real data. So what is the procedure which we propose here? We require and exploit the invariance assumption, and here it reads again, I look at the conditional for a certain set S star, and I want to see whether this is the same across my experimental settings. And this is kind of a statistical testing problem. Okay. So now you're away from graphs, you just check whether things are the same, and this is a statistical testing problem. I have a null hypothesis, H0 gamma S. So I take a set S of variables, I look for a regression parameter gamma, and I ask whether actually this gamma is such that the regression model is invariant across my experimental settings. So this simply means if this hypothesis is true, the model is correct, and S gamma are plausible causal variables of predictors or coefficients, or in other words, S gamma actually fulfill the invariance assumption. If the hypothesis is true, S gamma fulfill the invariance assumption. Okay. Then you get rid of the gamma and you just ask for something like this hypothesis H0, this is the null, for a set S. Yeah. Give me a set S of variables, and the hypothesis reads there exists a gamma such that I have the invariance assumption fulfilled with that set of variables S and some regression. So sets S which fulfill where this hypothesis is true, they fulfill the invariance assumption. And I call them, these are plausible, these are potential candidates to be causal predictors. Okay, so what can you identify? This is simple, trivial, but this is really what's going on. I'm not saying this is the most complete form, but with that kind of method or procedure, you can identify the following. I just take sets S where the invariance assumption holds. This is my notation. I take sets S where this hypothesis is true, and then I take the intersection of that. Okay? And that must be identified. So if a variable turns up in all these sets S, it will be in the intersection and it must be identified. It's a very easy logic and argument. So the intersection of all sets which fulfill the invariance assumption, this is identifiable, And then you have a couple of very easy properties which I find kind of worthwhile to point out. So let's assume the invariant assumption holds for a set S star. It could be the causal variables if my script D does not affect the structural equation of Y. So if S star is fulfilling the invariance assumption, well, the intersection is always smaller, so S star must be a superset of the intersection. And this is actually key. It's simple, but it's key to obtain confidence points. There's another thing which I find kind of interesting. So you have two experimental settings, E1, and then you have a larger one, E2. It's a superset of E1. And then trivially, you very easily derive that SE1 is a subset of SE2. So what you can identify with more experimental settings is a larger set. And that's kind of plausible. If you make more and more interventions, obviously you can identify them, right? So if you intervene at all the variables, you can identify them all. And that means with more interventions, let's call it more heterogeneity, more diversity in complex data, we can identify more causal predictors. So this is summarizing this. If I look at this SE, the intersection of all the sets which fulfill the invariance assumption, it's a growing function if I enlarge my space of experimental settings. And there's a question again, when is SE equal to S0, the two causal variables? And it's actually not that important. So the interesting question is, when I have equality here, this is an issue of, say, power of what is the maximal thing I could identify, but for my confidence statements, it doesn't matter. Nevertheless, I try to show a bit what that, how we can achieve this. So maybe this question again, when is SE equal to the set? So let's assume some sort of a model. Let's assume a linear structural equation model with Gaussian errors. So here it is. My parental variables are the causal variables. And now you need to discuss somehow what is this space of experimental settings. And we just look at a couple cases. And one case is do interventions. So I do interventions at single variables, different in Y, right? I've explained that before. Or I do noise or soft interventions at single variables. And what does that mean? So suppose E equals 1 is my experimental setting. It means for all other interventional settings, you actually change the error term. So if I do the soft intervention at variable Y, I have a different error term here. I scale it or I shift it. That's my intervention. So instead of a do intervention, you perturb your error distribution. Or you can do some sort of simultaneous noise intervention. So I say you have an observational setting E equals 1, and then some sort of an interventional setting E equals 2, and the interventional setting would mean it's like a change of environment. It has affected all your noise variables. So all the noise variables change. They either scale or shift actually for all the variables J simultaneously. Okay? So this is kind of just two experimental settings, but in experimental setting number 2, all the noise terms shift. And then you can prove that this SE, the intersection, actually equals the set of causal variables. If, and this is just certainly not the complete formulation or the tight formulation of what is possible. For example, you can do single do interventions for all variables other than Y. And it's a bit maybe a slightly trivial theorem. If I intervene at all different variables, if I do P do interventions, obviously I should be able to identify. But this is a proof of concept. I can't. So you intervene at all the X variables other than Y, and then you can identify the full problem. It's no miracle. I can do a single noise intervention for each variable other than Y, and then I can recover everything, or I can do this simultaneous noise intervention, just two experimental settings, but all the variables are effective. The conditions can be relaxed somewhat. We don't know the most complete formulation of the theorem, but we wanted to show that it is actually possible that you exactly get the S0. Now what I will say afterwards, or in the sequel, it's not really important that I have equality. So how do we get to statistical confidence sets for these causal predictors. And this is just the statistical part, and it's actually not very hard if you know a bit statistics. So all what I need to do is to do the finite sample version of that procedure. And the procedure is I need to get to this SE, it's the intersection of all the sets where the invariance assumption holds. And so I need to run statistical tests and do this intersection, and then I'm done. So maybe I'm going a bit quicker through that. So for any set S, you give me a set S, I test whether the invariance assumption holds for this set S. Let's skip confidence sets. Let's go to this one. And how do you do this? So I need to test this hypothesis. You give me a set S, and you want to see whether the invariance assumption holds. And all what you do, or what we propose to do, is you test constancy of the regression parameter and the constancy of the residual error distribution across your experimental setting. So how do you do this? Of course, this is not quite this hypothesis, but you weaken that. You look at a different hypothesis, call it H tilde, and H tilde is exactly this red stuff. You look at the regression parameter for a set S. That's the projection here, right? You do the projection of Y onto the variables from S. You get this parameter, you get the corresponding residual standard error, and you check whether this is constant and this is constant across all experimental settings. Okay. And so why can you do this weakening? This is this trivial thing. If H is true, H tilde is true, so if you reject H tilde, you have error control for H. So I'm skipping details, but the point is you can do this exactly. Suppose you have Gaussian errors, I can come up with a test statistic, I can do this test exactly. There's actually an F distribution involved. It's some sort of like classical statistics. You can do this. You can test whether the regression coefficient is constant across two or many experimental settings in the same probability standard. So do we have to go through all the sets S, right? I told you, well, you give me a set S and I test that, and eventually, you know, I want to do this thing here. I want to do the intersection over all S, and of course it is a disaster if I have 20,000 variables. I cannot easily go through all the sets S. So what you should keep in mind, and I must comment a bit from there, so I start with simple sets. Start with the empty set. If I accept the empty set, I'm done, right? The intersection must be the empty set. So I can just check marginally whether my Y remains constant across experimental conditions. If you accept that, you're done. Then you look at simple sets, sets S which have only one variable. If you accept one of them, you only need to look at subsets from that, just very small subsets. Now eventually you might end up with looking at a large set. And that becomes problematic if you have a very high dimensional problem. And here we do a trick, so to speak. We restrict the search space by variables from a lasso regression. So I have my Y, I run my lasso, L1 norm regularized regression, and under faithfulness and some conditions, I know that the variables which are picked by lasso, that the causal variables are contained in that set, and so it's allowed to look at this restricted search space. And that's how I get away computationally. But the first two things, actually, for many smaller sets you might accept, and then you can quickly look at small sets only. And only if sets are getting large, you restrict the search space to make this feasible. Let's skip that. So here is the theorem. So what can we say? We assume a linear model. This can be relaxed, but let's assume a linear model and Gaussian errors. Then my statistical test is correct, otherwise it's approximately correct. And then I have for any gamma star, S star, which satisfy the invariance assumption. So it's the invariance assumption, and I assume, okay, there is a gamma star and an S star which satisfy this assumption that these variables remain invariant across experimental conditions. Then look at the red part. Then this procedure, this finite sample version, has controllable probability to be contained in SE. And I know that S star must be a superset of SE because SE is the intersection. So I have a confidence bound, so I know this. Now how do I get to the causal variables? I told you before this proposition, if my experiments do not affect the Y structural equation, S0, the causal variables, are a solution of the invariance assumption. So if this holds, if E does not affect the structural equation of Y, I can pick or choose S star equal to be the causal variables, and then I have the statement, the probability that S hat is contained in the causal variables is bounded below by the Bühlmann assumption. So you're on the safe side. This is conservative. This is not equality. So that's a much more harder problem. This is conservative, but it's something kind of useful. If the procedure gives you something, you're on the safe side. We do not need to care about identifiability. If the effect is not identifiable, the method will not wrongly claim the effect. And I pointed that out a bit before. We do not require that S star is kind of minimal or unique, or I don't need the statement that SE equals S0. It's only a question of power. And what kind of power is here involved? There is an identifiability power. So I always have, if this holds, if E does not affect the structural equation of Y, I know that S0 is a superset of SE, or should be this potential equal, and ideally it's equal, right? But sometimes it's not, and then I lose out with it. So it's an identifiability power. And there's a statistical power saying that S hat E is a subset of SE, and ideally it's equal, but if I have, say, low sample size or anything like that, I cannot take the small effects, and then I don't have equal. So maybe this is the first result on statistical confidence for potentially non-identifiable causal predictors when the structure is unknown. You just give me data and I push this button. This is always a bit dangerous, and it spits out a set of variables with controllable probabilities, 80–95%. So hopefully, and according to empirical experience which we have so far, this seems to be more reliable and maybe somewhat more robust. I think the experts know here that fitting graphs to data, estimating a Markov equivalence class is an extremely hard problem on a finite number of data points. And if you have 10,000 variables and a couple hundred observations, it's just very, very hard, and you will make a lot of mistakes. Of course, this will make some mistakes too, but it seems that this is a bit more reliable. So we have empirical results. We compare with other methods. So what you see here is actually the family-wise error rate, the statistical type 1 error. We aim at 0.05. We look at very different scenarios, and actually the invariant prediction method is really controlled quite nicely at this confidence level. Then we have other procedures which don't come up with confidence statements, but you can just run them.
Is it synthetic data or it's real data?
This is synthetic, the real data. Other methods, they do not claim, of course, that you have error control. So here you have marginal correlation, regression, greedy equivalent search, greedy interventional equivalent search, Lingam. And if you look at power, what is the success probability to detect the true causal variables? This method which controls the type 1 error is actually comparable with Lingam or maybe greedy interventional equivalent research. So this is synthetic, I'm not claiming. So here's the real stuff. So this is single gene deletion experiment in yeast. This was your morning bread. So we have now a bit more than 6,000 genes involved. I remind you the response of interest Y is the expression of the first gene, and all other the covariates are the expression of all other genes, and then we go to the next one. The response of interest is the expression of the second gene, and the expression from all other covariates. So here are again our collaborators. I mentioned them before, and here is what's going on in a bit more detail. So we have 160 observational data points, and we have 1,479 interventional samples. So people did 1,479 single gene deletions. Okay. Now what we use with our method? Just two experimental settings. One is observational, and we throw all the interventional data points into one other setting. We it's kind of unspecific interventional setting. So we do a training test data splitting. So we put some test data aside, some of these 1,479, actually a third of them we put aside, and we try to predict the effects of these interventions. Then there are some sort of details. And then what do we find? 8 genes are found to be significant at the 0.01 level, so we make it very restrictive. Actually, this is the family-wide error control. And because you put some of the intervention as test data aside, you can check whether it was a true prediction or a false prediction. And 6 among the 8 were true predictions. And this is greedy interventional equivalent search. So what do? We take the 8 top scoring variables or genes and check about the causal or intervention effects. 2 of them were true. This is PCIDA, this is marginal correlation. So in that particular example, our invariant prediction method had most power because it detects 6 instead of only 2, and hopefully it exhibits reasonable control for the statistical time. So here is the kind of ROC type curve. So here you see the number of intervention predictions, here the number of true positives. So the red line is the one I explained you a bit. So the first prediction is it's a true one. Then the second is a true one, the third is a true one, the fourth is a true one, the fifth is a true one, and then the sixth prediction is a false. So this is quite nice performance. Then there are a couple other methods. The gray bar here is random guessing. And so, for example, this is PCIDA. This is, in this example, about as good as random guessing. It comes almost out of random guessing. So we have some sort of validation. I think my time is running out. So this is kind of the strong intervention effect. So this is actually something solid, I think. So you really put intervention, single gene deletion data aside. You try to predict it. We want to see whether you can predict it, and we make a very stringent criterion what is a true positive. We say it's a true positive if the effect is really in the very lower or upper tail of the corresponding observational distribution. So if you manipulate the gene and then this effector gene or affector gene is in the 1% or 99% tail of the corresponding observational distribution, we say it's a true effect. Some sort of concluding thoughts. This can be generalized to nonlinear models. The invariance assumption is exactly the same. Of course, the statistics becomes more difficult. Now you would need to test whether a non-parametric function remains the same across experimental settings. That's a much harder problem. We can generalize to a certain extent to hidden variables, but that's a hard problem. And here is kind of a provocative thought, which I think is kind of cute also. It's this kind of more big data aspect. So the idea is, okay, you have a large data set, and maybe you don't even have exactly the kind of experimental settings available. And it's thought provocative to say, okay, I structure this into potentially constructed groups of experimental settings. And so this construction, I now construct this cal E, the script E. This becomes an issue, a trade-off between identifiability and statistical power. If I make this script E large, I should be able to identify a lot, but then I have only a few data points in every experimental setting, so I don't have a lot of statistical power, and there's a trade-off. So why can this work potentially? So mathematically, you can think of script J are all experimental settings which satisfy the invariance assumption. Okay? Now, you actually, okay, you assume that this script J does not affect the structural equation for Y. This is somehow, this is how you can make it go. If it does not affect the structural equation of Y, then the invariance assumption holds. Now you can actually look at the distribution for an experimental setting in this context. And it's of course only a mixture of all these possibles. And now you pool these things. Now you have some sort of space of experimental setting, you change it, you construct a different one. For example, you pool experimental setting E1 and E2, it's a new mixture distribution with new mixture weights. And all these distributions satisfy the invariance assumption as well. So if it's satisfied for this overall script J, it's satisfied for every subgroup. That particular S star, gamma star will remain invariant, will remain the same for all these pooled samples. In conclusion, causal components remain the same for different subpopulations, different experimental settings. I think this is kind of our friend. We should exploit the power of heterogeneity in complex data, and then confidence bounds follow quite naturally. Thank you.
I'm involved in the development of a project with developmental psychologists that study how infants learn the causal structure of the world. I was curious whether your invariant assumption can act as a general principle of how we learn the causal structure of the world around us, because we try to get in different environments, experiment in different conditions, etc.
I think on a superficial level, yes. I think it's a very general assumption. It could tie into very many different settings, but one should keep in mind somehow, I'm going to go all back over the slides. The question is, for me, it becomes a bit philosophical, but the question is, can we link invariance to the causal thing? And so the causal machinery is the structural equation model, are the parents, and the assumption to do that is actually these different experimental settings are not allowed to change the structural equation for your response variable of interest. Now, if you have just arbitrary change of environments, you're not sure with the results.
Can you say a little bit about? Can you say a little bit about the what happens if causal sufficiency fails? So if you don't have all the observed variables, because it would seem like if I just had a confounder between x and y, and then I did some experiments on other things, I might still have variance.
So this is not quite finished in greater detail, but I mean the issue is the confounder. So it's kind of like in some models you can actually. Well, here's the first thing, but this is so here the confounder is not allowed. So here's y. Here are hidden variables. It's not interesting. So you're more interested maybe in this one. So here is, let's look at this graph here. Here's y, x is split in cause and effect. I have here a hidden, and here is my experimental setting. And so what is not allowed, again, is that the experimental setting has a direct influence on the confounder. If it has, I don't know if it's of this structure, we can do that. It's unknown, maybe it's questionable whether it's
Is that why you're calling them potential causes?
No, that's maybe a bad terminology. It has nothing to do with...
No, but when you said it was, with your hypothesis, you said it was plausible causal.
Yeah, yeah. So potential or plausibly, it's a candidate, so such that it could happen.
I'm confused. I'm confused that you're modeling gene expression variables with a directed acyclic graph, because isn't it the case that one of the things we definitely know about genes is that they're not, they won't form an acyclic graph. There will be cycles because it's good engineering. If you want to control the expression level of a gene product, you'll have some sort of negative feedback loop from the gene product itself to the expression level of some parent of that gene product. So isn't it full of cycles?
I have an easy answer to that. All models, or this model is wrong, but it might be useful. So I think this becomes an issue of complexity in your modeling. So obviously that's true, and actually these people, they work on models also where there's feedback, but you need other assumptions. It's just very hard if you have thousands of variables and sample size is not that large. You need to reduce complexity, and one thing to reduce complexity is you do not allow cycles. So it's an easier model. It's certainly not the true model, a correct model. I don't have it on the slide. I think despite this p-values, and it's a good point, we should be extremely careful, or we should avoid to use this to make confirmatory statements. I think this might be a good tool for designing your future next experiment in the lab. And of course, with yeast or plants, you can do this. In the medical context, it's very questionable. I don't have a... People try, of course, this, but I think most people fail so far to try to model this in more detail. So this is an approximate model. I don't know whether it's a good model or